Today I want to talk to you about the Greek word for righteousness, which is dikaiosune. Calm down. I know that just excites you to no end, but you have to control yourself. Let's start by contrasting righteousness with justice. The two are related, but distinct, right? But how would you articulate the difference between righteousness and justice? Imagine you're standing before a judge. You'd expect the judge to be just, right? You would expect justice from the judge. It's implied in the title. Well, what does that mean? It means that they would rule according to the law, not according to their private whims or personal prejudices or political affiliation. It means that they would be fair, that they would treat everyone the same, that they wouldn't accept a bribe or be swayed by anyone's wealth or influence, whether the plaintiff or the defendant. Now, here's the question. Would you expect the judge to be righteous? Is righteousness a prerequisite for them doing their job? Not just a preference, but a requirement? I think most people would say no, not necessarily. It's not a requirement or an expectation, though it would certainly be advantageous if they were. But why not? What does it mean when we say that someone is righteous? Well, first of all, righteousness is an individual matter. It's personal and perhaps even private, whereas justice is a public matter. It's a societal matter. We want our society to be just, but few would argue that it needs to be righteous, at least not using that term. Righteousness also has at least a religious connotation, if it's not explicitly religious, whereas justice is a legal matter, which also means it belongs in the secular sphere, not the religious sphere. And being both personal and religious, one could say that righteousness has to do with avoiding the personal sins, lying, adultery, or any sex outside of marriage, viewing pornography, or any other kind of immorality. These things don't have much or anything to do with justice, unless it's lying under oath in a legal setting. But adultery isn't a legal matter, it's a moral matter. And particularly for Christians, righteousness is something that is closely tied to being saved, whereas justice is viewed as something you perhaps pursue as a result of your salvation, but not something tied into becoming or being saved. Which brings up another contrast between justice and righteousness. Whereas justice is something you do, righteousness is something you become and then are. It's a state of being. A person can also be just, but you have righteousness. It's something you possess. You are just when you act justly, but you act righteously only if you are righteous. Is that a fair depiction of justice and righteousness? I mean, you may quibble around the edges, but I think that's kind of got it. Two words and two different concepts with some overlap, but still distinct, right? Okay, so here's the kicker. In the New Testament, both justice and righteousness are used to translate dikaiosune. It's one word. And whereas we know that a single word can have multiple meanings, those meanings usually have a great deal of overlap, and the differences are more shades of meaning than distinct meanings with clear lines between them. But what we have here is one Greek word with two related but very different English words. And the story behind that is really very interesting and quite revealing. But before we get into how one Greek word came to be translated in two different ways in English, we actually need to go back in time to Hebrew. Because here's the thing that you always have to keep in mind and must never forget, although honestly, Christianity did in fact ignore this for hundreds of years. Though the New Testament writers all wrote in Greek, they weren't Greek. They didn't think like Greeks. They didn't share the same worldview as the Greeks, even if some of them, many of them perhaps, were Hellenized Jews to use Greek as their primary language. They were still Jews. They thought like Jews. They had a Jewish worldview. They were Jews who spoke and wrote in the Greek language. When we read the New Testament, we are reading Jewish concepts expressed in the Greek language. Think of it this way. I am an American male who was born in the South in the 20th century, and I now live in the mid-Atlantic states in the 21st century. And I can never escape that. I can't take it off like a jacket and then put on another jacket while I learn Koine Greek, the common Greek used in the New Testament. And while I can study first century life in Judea, Samaria, and Galilee and come to some understanding of how those people thought, it will always be filtered through my lens as an American male born in the South in the 20th century and living in the mid-Atlantic in the 21st century. And if I learn to speak and read Spanish, I will be expressing American thoughts and concepts in Spanish, not the thoughts and concepts of a person from Spain or Mexico or Colombia. So when the New Testament writers wrote Dikaiosini, they were thinking of the Hebrew concept and translating the Hebrew idea. So how is the Hebrew concept and Hebrew idea expressed in the Hebrew language? Well, with two words, actually. In the Old Testament, when you see righteousness, that's translating the Hebrew word tzaddik. And when you see justice, it's translating the Hebrew word mishpat. So, what's the difference between tzaddik and mishpat? Is mishpat a legal term and tzaddik a religious term? Is mishpat about a fair and equitable society while tzaddik is about personal morality? Is mishpat what you do once you get saved while getting tzaddik is what gets you saved, that is, forgiven in the first place? No, I mean, not even close. Those distinctions just don't hold in Jewish thought. First of all, they wouldn't understand what we mean by secular versus religious. That's a modern, largely European and American distinction. In Jewish thought, everything is religious. Everything is spiritual. Before they became monotheists, they believed that the gods were behind everything, just like the Canaanites and the Egyptians and the Greeks, Romans, and pretty much everybody. Everybody believed that the gods were behind everything. The sun shines because of the sun god, and storms come because of the storm god. The sea was ruled by the sea god, and good harvests were because the fertility god or goddess was pleased. And even after the Jews became monotheist, not just worshiping one God, but believing that only one God stands behind everything, they just shifted their beliefs over to the one God. He, and they believed that their God was a he, not yet coming to the realization that the one true God both encompasses and transcends any notions of gender. He brought rain and drought. He caused storms. He controlled the seas. And he gave good harvests, or bad. And so religion was a means of appeasing God so that he brought rain, not drought. Calm days, not destructive storms. A safe voyage on the sea rather than a capsized vessel. A good harvest, not a bad harvest. But everything was spiritual. Everything was religious. Some things were sacred, but everything was religious. The idea that mishpat concerned things in society while tzaddik concerned a person's private spiritual life wouldn't make any sense to them either. There was no personal life aside from the larger group. Each individual was a member of a family and a clan and a tribe and sometimes maybe a nation. But they derived their identity from the family, from the clan, from the tribe. And any anyone who didn't have a family, clan, or tribe, well, it was as if they didn't exist. They were a nobody. So our modern understanding of justice and righteousness wouldn't have made any sense to them, which is why I've used the Hebrew words and not their English translations here in these last few minutes. Because what we mean by the individual words justice and righteousness is not what they meant by mishpat and tzaddik. And I'd rather use the foreign words because, in fact, the words and the concepts are foreign to us. The truth is that mishpat and tzaddik are not two words that mean related but very distinct things, but are really two sides of one coin. They are more synonyms that work together than separate words representing separate concepts. And in fact, they often, if not usually, appear together, righteousness and justice, justice and righteousness, both having the idea of a person doing the right thing to another person on behalf of another person for another person. You see it in Hebrew poetry, which uses parallelism, which is one phrase followed by another that means essentially the same thing. Amos does this 3 times in a very short span. First, he condemns the leaders of Israel. Ah, you that turn justice to wormwood and bring righteousness to the ground. Then he demands that they do what's right, not just for themselves, but for all the people of Israel, in a verse famously used by Dr. King. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And then he once again levels his accusations against them. But you have turned justice into poison and the fruit of righteousness into wormwood. So if you want to understand what mishpat and tzaddik convey, take all those distinctions that we made in the beginning and just mash them all together, combining the individual and the personal, the societal and the collective, stirring together morality and sinlessness with fairness, equity, and impartiality, blending salvation and sanctification together. In other words, the state of being saved with the behavior that comes from being saved, but with the further understanding that the behavior leads to the state, which leads to further behavior, leading to a furtherance of the state in an ongoing feedback loop. And when you mash these two concepts together, what you get in Greek is one word, dikaiosune. And then, when it came time to translate the Greek into English, guess what we did? We took the one mashed up word and we divided it into 2 English words. But we didn't just simply reverse the smashing, stirring, and blending. We created 2 words that don't really correspond to the 2 Hebrew words, representing 2 very European non-Jewish concepts that don't really represent the Old Testament concepts. And then we translated the Old Testament Jewish words using those non-Jewish English words, completing a conceptual substitution that is self-validating. In other words, it uses the terms to define the terms. When you get behind the English words, we learn some things. Justice is simply an anglicized version of the Latin justitia. We didn't translate the Latin. We just brought the word over to English and changed the pronunciation a little bit. Righteousness is very interesting. It comes from the 16th century English rightwise, which is from the Old English rightwise. And if that looks kind of German, it's because it is. Its roots are the old German reit or recht, think rectify, as in make something right. And It's the German monk, scholar, and reformer Martin Luther, who is arguably the most influential Protestant theologian even to this day. The roots of our translation of dikaiosune as righteousness are German, and it is Martin Luther who defined theologically what that word means. And Martin Luther's big thing was salvation by grace alone without any mixture of works. And by any mixture of works, Luther went to extremes. He said that even the faith to believe in Christ is a gift from God. It comes from God. Because if it came from humans, well, that's too much like a work. Anything a human did was work, whether it was believing God or accepting Christ or having faith in Jesus. All these were things that God did in us to bring us to salvation, Martin Luther taught. So, therefore, Luther said, faith is something you have, not something you do. You have it because God gave it to you. If you did faith, something that sounds weird in English, but is actually a good way of expressing the Greek, well, if you did faith, that would be a work which would obligate God to give you something that you earned because of the work that you did. So in Luther's thinking, you don't do faith. You have faith as a gift from God. And likewise, you don't do righteousness, according to Luther. Righteousness is a status that is assigned to you by God when you, by grace, through faith, accept God's gift of salvation. And at that moment, He considers you to be righteous, and it has nothing to do with what you did before that moment, good or bad. And it has nothing to do with what you do after that moment, again, good or bad. In other words, Luther taught that you are considered righteous even if you never do anything righteous. You're still righteous. You are saved, which is the same thing in Luther's mind. And if you can't lose your salvation, then you can't ever become unrighteous, because righteousness isn't something you do. And that would have been news to the Old Testament writers, who insisted that people do both righteousness and justice. Blessed are those who observe justice and do righteousness at all times. To do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. And I don't think Luther intended for this to happen, but by eliminating the doing part of righteousness, leaving only justice as something that you do, and then making being righteous as virtually synonymous with being saved, while distancing justice from having anything to do with our salvation, he set the table for our modern distinction between the secular and the religious, making righteousness solely a religious and spiritual term, and justice solely a secular and non-spiritual term, where you can be righteous in God's eyes and do nothing about justice or injustice, or something if you want. It's your choice. Doesn't matter, because what difference does it make if you give a cup of cold water to a thirsty man if he's not saved? A cup of water isn't going to do him any good in hell. And every hour you spend seeking to right injustice is an hour you aren't spending in evangelism. And all the energy you spend dealing with injustice is energy not spent on helping sinners become righteous. All the money you spend on reducing homelessness and eliminating hunger and poverty and advancing civil rights is money you aren't spending on advancing the gospel. As if justice is somehow antithetical to the gospel. And if you listen to some people, it is. Unfortunately, History tells us what happens when you separate righteousness and justice like this. Just look at Luther's Germany, which was largely a Christian nation when the Nazis took over. And I'm not saying that many Christians became Nazis. Most Germans weren't members of the Nazi Party. But too many went along, and there was nothing in their faith that provided enough dissonance to question it, because being saved had nothing to do with doing justice. And before that, the English colonists who brought over kidnapped Africans to America, and the American planters who bought those Africans, both in the North and in the South, were by and large good church-going Christians, because being a good Christian had nothing to do with doing justice. And after Reconstruction fell apart and Jim Crow laws were passed and enforced, the ones passing the laws and enforcing the laws, which everyone knew were unjust at the time, but said were necessary to maintain law and order and our way of life, they were baptized church-going Christians. But they did it because being a good Christian had nothing to do with doing justice. And the weird thing is, while we can imagine a judge being just but not necessarily righteous, if I had asked you at the beginning if you could imagine a judge who was righteous but not just, you'd look at me like I was crazy. Yet that's exactly the situation you get when you define righteousness as a state of being apart from anything that you do and unmoored from the necessity to do justice. The problem with sin is not just that it diminishes our relationship with the holy God, but that it diminishes our relationships with others on both an interpersonal and a societal level. Which is why Jesus told us that loving others, including our enemies, is as important as loving God. And we need a salvation that not only involves restoring our relationship with God through forgiveness and reconciliation, but also restoring our relationships with others through forgiveness and reconciliation. But that's not all. The problem with sin is not only that it diminishes our relationships with God and with others, but that it diminishes our very humanity. Sin makes us act in ways that are less than human, that are inhuman, that are subhuman. And any salvation that doesn't address that falls short of the glory of God. A righteous person is a person who does righteousness. And a person who does righteousness is a person who is becoming righteous. A just person is a person who does justice, and a person who does justice is becoming a just person. Which comes first? Who cares? It's a feedback loop, and the important thing is to get in the loop. And like most things, the more you do it, the better you'll get. And the better you get, the more you'll become what you want to be. And when you fall short of that, as we all inevitably do, we know that God, through the grace of Christ and the power of His Spirit, will make up the difference. Until that day, when we are presented before the throne of God by Jesus, the author and fulfiller of our faith, and we find that we are perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Father, I pray that we will love justice and righteousness as much as you do, and that we will pursue them with the same fervor that you pursue them. And I pray that we will grieve as you grieve when you see injustice and unrighteousness, a grief that is for the victim of injustice, but also for the perpetrator, for they are more diminished than those they themselves diminish. And I pray that we will get as angry as you when you see injustice. Not an anger that demands retribution, but an anger that refuses to abide the situation and is forced to rectify the wrong. And I pray that we will be as patient as you have been, for not all wrongs are righted quickly or easily, and it takes time to change people's behaviors, and even more time to change their hearts. And I pray that we will persevere as you have persevered. For you are playing the long game and have to play it much longer than we do in our short lives. And may we never grow weary in doing right. For in due season we will reap a harvest of blessing if we do not grow weary. Through Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.